Oops. Start recording. Recording has started. Okay, fine. Yeah. Just a moment. Meeting option, and I will. Yeah. Let me just. Oops. Okay, so we start the lecture. The first lecture on musculoskeletal system, structure and function. Now, human body consists of a musculoskeletal system. So first we look into the skeletal system. There are different types of bone which actually constitute together the skeletal system. There is long bone, there is short bone, there is flat bone, irregular bones, and round bones, more precisely known as sesamoid bones. Okay. Altogether, there are 206 bones in the human skeleton. 210 to be more precise if we count the two sesamoid bones that lie under the head of the first metatarsal in each foot in most people. Okay, so precisely 2010, if you consider the first metatarsal, or generally we can say that there are 206 bones in the human skeleton. Now, how this whole organization of the skeletal system works. So we have axial skeleton and appendicular skeleton. Okay, so within the classification of axial skeleton, we have the skull, we have the thorax, and the vertebral column. Okay, with the skull, thorax, and the vertebral column marked in orange color. Clear? An appendicular skeleton, we have that is marked in green in this in the figure, green color. Just let me check whether everything is going on smoothly. Yeah. So the appendicular skeleton is marked in the green color. So we have the upper limbs, we have the lower limbs, the pectoral girdle, and the pelvic girdle. Okay. So mostly it is the limbs, upper limb, lower limb, and the pectoral pelvic girdle consists majority of the skeletal system, and it is marked in the green. So that are the skeletal system under the appendicular skeleton, and the axis skeleton is skull, thorax, and vertebral column. Now, in order to study the subject biomechanics, we need to refer to anatomical planes and directions. Okay, similar to engineering drawing that we have learned at the first year level. So very basic things, how do we define different planes and directions? We have, say, 3 planes, as you can see in the figure A. This is the clinical terms. So you just get used to some clinical terms because you need to understand certain terminology which defines, figures or in certain planes. So you have the coronal plane, you have the axial plane. Axial planes are slices, sort of slices. So we have the CT scan made in axial planes, for example. Okay, And then sagittal plane, which is normal to the coronal plane. Coronal plane is more through the mid-frontal plane, and sagittal plane is normal to the coronal plane. Okay, so we have these three anatomic planes, and then we have the directions. Okay, now if we consider the front view, for example, in engineering terms of a body, then you can see that if you follow the arrow, the midline is through, the midline is located through the body this way. So it goes through the middle. Anything towards the midline, is called medial. Anything towards the midline is called medial. Anything towards anything away from the midline is opposite, is called lateral. Okay, so anything towards the midline is medial, anything away from the midline is lateral. Towards top of the system is superior, and towards bottom is inferior. So superior, inferior is easily you can recognize. Medial, lateral I have defined. Anterior and posterior, towards front is anterior, towards back is posterior. Apart from anterior, posterior, it is also sometimes the clinicians say ventral or dorsal. Okay, and towards up is cranial, towards down is caudal. So these are terms which you might come across at different levels. These are typically clinical terms, how they define an object within space. Now, as you can see, that if you look from the front, it is the figure on the right is this is the anterior view. Okay, if you are looking the side view, as we generally call it in engineering drawing, the side view is we are looking from the lateral side. So it is a lateral view. And of course, left, right, you can easily understand. But generally, these are the directions that are sometimes used that would be used in this course sometimes. Just to clarify, can everybody follow? Just a quick question. Hello?
Yes, sir.
It's okay with you?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so I'm going back to the presentation again. I have to do this initially because I'm not sure whether you are you could follow everything or not.
Sir?
Yeah.
What's the difference between the superior, inferior, and the cranial caudal directions?
Yes, sir, same.
Yeah. See, these are, we mostly say superior. Cranial caudal is less used, but cranial caudal is used sometimes. These are synonymous terms. Okay, like proximal and distal. Perhaps you know proximal and distal is also quite common. Proximal is towards the top, distal is towards bottom. Okay, so the clinicians generally use the term more proximal and distal. If you sort of define a bone, say a femur, so the femur head is located on the proximal side of the femur. You get my point? Okay. And the condyle, the femoral condyle, which forms the knee joint, is actually at the distal, is located at the distal part of the femur. Is that a good example? Hello?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So these are things which are a little bit, what we can say, synonymous, so as to say, but this superior, inferior, this is some, when a bony landmark or bony part is defined, they sometimes say with respect to this is located superiorly or inferiorly. You get my point? This is the language I have come across over years. It's the way you define it. So you define a location or a bony landmark, which is located at a comparatively superior or inferior location with respect to some another reference point. Okay, so this is what is used. Generally speaking, that if you go and do an X-ray, if you go to a doctor, he recommends an X-ray. If you and then what does he write? So he writes epilateral sometimes. That means he needs actually two views. One is anterior posterior view, and the other view is AP and then lateral. That means lateral medial or medial lateral. So the lateral view, already you have seen the side view. So he wants a side view and he wants a front view of the, say, of the bone that we are trying to investigate something from the image of any fracture or something. So that is how the terminology is defined. Okay. So let me go back to the presentation. Hello.
Sir, could you please use highlighter instead of cursor?
Highlighter. I have to, in that case, I have to, where is the highlighter?
Sir, you simply right click on the screen and then choose the highlighter.
Okay, I'll do that. Pointer option. Oh, here is a laser pointer. Okay, that's nice. So anatomical terms is summarized here. You can see the anterior, posterior. They describe structures at the front, anterior, and back posterior of the bodies. Superior, inferior, proximal, distal. This I was telling you this proximal and distal describe a position that is closer, proximal or further distal from the trunk of the body. So in a way, the shoulder is proximal to the arm and the foot is distal to the knee. Medial, lateral, also sometimes, very rarely I've seen they also use ventral dorsal. Okay. So describe structures derived from the front. So from the anterior side is ventral and posterior is dorsal. So these are also synonymous terms, similar to cranial and caudal. Okay, so you can see cranial is more superior and caudal is inferior. Now, as you all know that we are discussing the musculoskeletal system, and within that, femur is the longest and the strongest bone. Okay, if I was in a class, I have exact replica of femurs, and I could have shown you. You could have got a feel of the structure. So the femur is the longest and the strongest bone, and there are certain anatomic bony landmarks that defines within the femur, and we have you can see we have the head of the femur, which forms the hip joint, which is a spherical joint, and it offers us a large range of movements mostly in form of rotations. Okay, so the head is spherical. This forms the hip joint with the pelvic bone. Then there is a very interesting part which is called the neck, like our body. We have a head, and then there is a area which is less in cross section, and it is called the neck. So from the head, the cross section of the bone actually reduces drastically and forms the neck. And then it forms the main body or the shaft of the femur. You can see the shaft of the femur. And before that, there are two bony landmarks. One is called the greater trochanter and the lesser trochanter. Okay, these are bony landmarks, important bony landmarks on the femur, where there is a lot of important. This serves as attachment sites for very important muscles that actually form the hip joint. Okay, so greater trochanter and lesser trochanter are bony landmarks which serves as more as the attachment sites of important muscles. Now, generally, you see we divide, or rather classify, epiphysis, diaphysis, and metaphysis. Okay, three major parts. Okay, so epiphysis is the region where the femur connect with other bones. That is, it forms the joint. Okay, so this is the femur head, and this is where it forms the hip joint. The diaphysis, or the central part of the shaft, this is composed of hard cortical bone. I will enter into details of bone, but not now. Just you can feel that the shaft of the femur is very hard and dense, compact cortical bone made of, and it is hollow. So it is either dense, hard cortical bone or nothing, or no other type of bone inside. It's rather a cavity which is called intermedullary cavity, and it is filled with bone marrow. So the shaft is a hard, strong bone, and it is basically the function is transfer of load. So huge amount of load actually is transferred from the head through the shaft to the distal part of the femur. Now, what is metaphysis? Metaphysis is a chunk of bone. You can see in both sides. The distal, this is the proximal part of the femur, and also in the distal part. This part actually consists of large chunk of bone, and it is mostly it is composed of cancellous bone or the porous bone. Okay, so with a thin layer of cortical or cortex which covers the cancellous bone stock. Okay, and these are sites for muscle attachments. You can see, so the metaphysis on both sides, the proximal and the distal part of the femur, actually serves as attachment sites of for muscles. Like, as I told you, greater trochanter and lesser trochanter. You can see it. And so this is, in a sense, how the structure of the femur is defined, and along with the gross functions of the different parts of the femur. So we can say that the head, neck, greater trochanter, lesser trochanter forms the proximal part of the femur, whereas the distal part is the part that forms the knee joint with the femoral condyles. Now, what is the function of bone? The first, most important function is to support the body weight. Okay? It supports the body weight, and it provides protection to vital organs. Okay, you can see in the photo here. So there's a rib cage which houses actually very, very vital organs like the lungs and the heart. Okay, the skull houses the brain. Okay, so bone actually protects vital organs, and within this pelvic girdle, you can see here, you have also many vital organs. So bones and muscles interact when the limb moves. So it provides, due to this interaction between bones and muscle, it provides mobility, or it enables mobility. The second important function of bone is formation of blood cells. Okay, so it forms actually blood cells, and it also provides a storage house of very, very important essential minerals like calcium, phosphate, magnesium, sodium, and potassium. So together with these three functions, vital functions of bone, we are actually, it is, you can imagine that it is providing support, it is providing protection, it is providing movement, it is producing blood cells, so that gives the blood formation, blood cell formation. So it goes on, it's a continuous process, and it is also providing storage to essential minerals. So that actually is three most vital functions of bone. Now, if I try to look inside the bone structure, for example, so grossly it gives me a picture that it has two types. It is, if I look into a cross section of a femur, for example, or any other bone, say humerus, or just take a stocky bone sample, and if you cut it through or image it, you see basically two parts, two types. One is very dense, compact bone, and inside there is a spongy structure, which is very, very interesting. Okay. Now, this spongy bone often is known as spongy bone, but it is precisely called cancellous bone or trabecular bone. Okay. And this cancellous bone or trabecular bone or spongy bone, the density of this bone actually varies from location to location. Okay, so you can see also from the image that somewhere here you can see near where there is the neck of the femur, it is more porous, less dense than actually the structure somewhere near the greater trochanter, okay, or towards the femur head. Okay, if you look into this picture, also you can see that the density of the bone, spongy bone or the cancellous bone, is clearly, you can see that it is varying from location to location. Okay, but of course, compact bone is compact by definition, so it has very little pores. It is mostly dense, hard, and high strength, and it is in a structure, mostly, not in all cases, it is covering the cancellous bone stalk, so as to say. So you can see here that the spongy bone is clearly, you can see that there are variation in the density of the spongy bone and covered by compact bone layer. Muscles. So there are approximately 700 different muscles in the human body. Okay, and this can be divided into three types, or classified into three types. So you have the skeletal muscles, which are directly attached to the bones and moves the skeleton. So together with the bone and the muscle, we are actually getting movements, different types of movements. Apart from the skeletal muscle, we have the cardiac muscles. Okay, so muscle of the heart, involuntary muscle, and third one is smooth or visceral muscles. Okay, so this is typically the structure of muscle. You can see skeletal structure, you have bone. Now, what is actually attaching a muscle bundle to bone? It is basically tendon. Tendon, muscle, these are actually classified under the category of soft tissue. Bone is a hard tissue. Okay, so there is a gross difference between the type of tissue. What one is bone, the other is muscle. Another very frequent term that you come across is ligaments. So the tendon, as you might know, that attaches muscle with bone. So the function of tendon is to actually control, and it controls the attachment, that controls the attachment of the muscle to the bone. So the function of the different functions of the muscle can be summarized as motion. So it provides, it's a primary musculoskeletal sort of element that actually provides, it's responsible for motion, maintenance of a posture, okay, and it also is responsible for heat production. Now, just to elaborate a little bit on the skeletal muscles, you can see the structure of the skeletal muscles. You can see the muscle fibers. Okay, so skeletal muscles muscles consist of numerous subunits or bundles called fasciles. Okay, so it has numerous bundles called fasciles. Fasciles are also surrounded by connective tissue, and each fascile is composed of numerous muscle fibers. Okay, so this is a muscle fiber. Okay, you can see structure of a muscle fiber. So these are a little descriptive part of the skeletal system. And we have the skeletal muscles are usually attached to bone by tendons composed of connective tissue. This connective tissue also draws the entire muscle and is called epimysium. Okay. The ligaments, which is another very important member of the musculoskeletal system, is also a fibrous connective tissue, and it is categorized under soft tissue. So ligament is a fibrous connective tissue that connects bone to bone, okay, and is also known as articular ligament, fibrous ligament, or true ligament. Okay, so basically, if you see a hip joint, you can see that it consists of two different bones. One is the pelvic bone, another is the femur bone, and there are several ligaments which connects these two bones, and they form the hip joint. So the ligaments actually hold, you can see the ligaments actually connects the two bones and they hold it in place and they finally form a mechanical joint, which offers us specific range of motions. Now, if you consider a knee joint, you can see very clearly that these two bony parts are basically detached. One is the femur, another is the tibia, and on the side you have the fibula. Okay, but there is no pin that goes inside and they form a hinge like we have hinge joint in a mechanical system. Okay, or doors and windows, you know very easily that there is a pin somewhere that connects, and the two parts are connected. But in this anatomic joint, basically the ligaments crisscross from the side. Also, they form crisscross like the cruciate ligament. So we have the ACR and PCR, the anterior cruciate ligament and the posterior cruciate ligament in the middle that crisscrosses and forms a very stable, apart from, of course, the lateral collateral ligament and medial collateral ligament. So we have on the two sides the lateral collateral ligament. One is lateral, another is medial. Of course, the two sides. From the two sides, it's holding the joint, holding the two bones in place. And in the middle, we have the crisscross, very strong ligaments, ACR and PCR. Okay, so these actually together forms a very stable knee joint. So the ligaments connects bone to bone, and they actually control the sole responsibility is to control the movement. The tendon is as I told you earlier, the tendon is responsible for connection between muscles. You see the skeletal muscles to bone. It connects skeletal muscles to bone. There is a tough band of fibrous connective tissue that usually connects muscle to bone and is capable of withstanding tension. So large amount of tension it can withstand. So tendons may also attach muscles to structures such as eyeball. The tendon serves to move the bone or the structure. So it is also responsible for movement. The tendon is extremely important, although its main function is to connect the skeletal muscle to bone. It plays a very important role in movement. So you probably have come across problems like tennis elbow. Once upon a time, Sachin Tendulkar had tennis elbow. And, you know, it is a small thing, the tendon in the whole system. But if you have that tennis elbow problem, it is also known as tendonitis. You cannot even pick up the pen. Okay, so these are so important element in the musculoskeletal system. When there is a problem, then only we understand its contribution in or function in the whole system. So tendons are similar to ligaments, and all three are made of collagen. So you can see a ligament is a fibrous connective tissue which attaches bone to bone and usually serves to hold the structure together and keep them stable. So the contribution of the ligament is forming. You can see it holds the structure means more than one bone that forms the joint. It holds it in place and also is responsible for the stability, the mechanical stability of the joint. Now, after this slide, I'm trying to summarize the anatomical joints and trying to compare it with the mechanical joints. After this slide, we will go back and have some discussion in the class, some feedback from the students. So we have the rigid body model. On one side, we have the anatomic elements like bone, joints, muscle, tendon, ligament. On the other side, we have the mechanical analogy. Okay, so bone actually are like rigid links in the structure. Okay, and the joints that are formed, the anatomical joints, they are actually comparable to the standard joints that we are aware of. Okay, like hinge, ball and socket, pin joint, hinge joint, ball and socket joint, saddle joint. There are different kinds of joint that I will show you the slide later on. So joints, anatomical joints are similar to mechanical joints that basically provides us different kinds of movement. Muscle plus tendon are like actuators responsible for moving or controlling a mechanism or system. Okay, so they serve the purpose of a actuator, muscle plus tendon. The ligaments are actually controllers or act like springs. So basically monitors and physically alters the operating condition of a given dynamic system. Okay. So this is a summary of the anatomic element as compared to a mechanical element. I'll now go back to the classroom. Hello. Any questions, please, at this point?
So there are some questions in the chat box.
Okay. Now, specifically, as there is, no, I only see very few. I think we have, what is the difference between cranial, superior? These I have already answered. But what is this phobia capitis? Who is this?
So it was in
Sachin
the
Joshi.
femur diagram. So it was in the femur diagram. It was just labeled, so I could not understand what exactly that was.
Okay, I'll just have a look. Yeah, this is basically, you see, it's a small part of the femur head. Okay, that actually there's a, you know, that to keep a bone alive, there is the necessity of blood supply. Okay, so there is a way. It's a small bony landmark, which sometimes, you know, you see, if you type it, if I just Google it, just let me find it for you. Just a moment. Basically, this bony, this landmark, this particular is not grossly visible, but it is there. It is this phobia capitis. Just a moment. So this. Yeah, so you have this a very small oval shaped, as I told you, very small, hardly grossly you might not be able to see, but you can see it when you move at a closer level on top of the femur. So it's a small bony landmark, something like that. Yeah. So it has a specific purpose. Can everybody see this?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Can you see this? So this is the irregularity on the femur head. Okay, and you can see here it's marked very clearly. Okay, but generally it forms a part of the femur head. Anything else? Yeah, I think Akshay Kaushik, sir, how motion gets transmitted to bones when the muscle expands because the tendons can only be in tension. See, all these elements, anatomical elements like muscle, ligament, tendon, they all act in tension. They cannot act in compression. It's like cable. Okay, they are tension elements. Now, how this motion gets transmitted, that we will get to know a little bit later. Okay, we have a full detailed lecture on the kinematics and the motion. But at this moment, we are trying to understand quickly the musculoskeletal system, because we need to understand it from mechanical engineer's point of view. Okay, so we need to understand the relationship between structure and function. Now, the muscles together with the ligaments and the tendons, whenever we actually do an activity, the muscle is a powerhouse. So muscle basically provides the initial sort of movement, well supported by the bony structure. So the muscle gives you the main thrust, okay, in performing a certain movement, and through the ligament actually controls the movement, and it provides stability to the joint. And the rigid links, as defined in form of bones, the bones are basically rigid links. They are providing support as well as, to some extent, stability to the whole structure. So how this whole thing moves, we can learn more later. But at this moment, we are interested very quickly to learn the system so that we get used to the different kinds of movement that is provided and the elements that forms the anatomical system or the musculoskeletal system as a whole. So can I move on with the lecture a little bit more? We have some time left. Hello?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Another 5 minutes or so. Okay. Okay. So this is basically the comparison that I have already explained to you. Now comes the joints. Okay. So just try to look the student who had. So this is somewhere a blood vessel is going inside the fovea capitalis. Okay. So this is the femur head, and there is some blood supply through this area. So the joints, as I was telling you, there are several joints within the musculoskeletal system, and these joints actually offers different range of motions. Okay, that basically translates into different kinds of physiological activity that we perform during our daily life. Now, articulation, joints, articulating joints, we also say sometimes it is basically a site where two or more bones meet, and joints are of course the weakest link in the skeletal system. Okay, so we have there are certain clinical classification based on function. So classification which is functional, amount of movement allowed. So we have immovable joint, slightly movable joint, and fully movable joint. So these have their clinical names. The synarthrosis. So you can see that it is the names vary with the type of movement. So one is immovable joint, another is slightly movable joint, and the third one is fully movable joint, which is the arthrosis. So structurally, the classification can be also made structurally based on the material binding the bone. So we have fibrous joints, bone ends united by collagenous fibers. So this is fibrous joint. You know, quite common is sutures. Okay, when just a moment, the sutures. I will show you some pictures of this a little bit later in the slide. Then we have the cartilaginous joints. The bones are actually united by cartilage, and very common in the articulating joint is the synovial joints, which actually consist of the synovial fluid. You might have come across in your school days of all these terms. So example of fibrous joints are sutures. Also, this is immovable joints. So some joints are there in the human skull, but why I don't see it fully? Just a moment. Okay. So we have the, this is the example of a suture. We have another example of the joint that in the dental system. So we have the gomphosis. So we have, you can see typically a tooth, and you have, it is attached to the mandible basically, and you can see that the attachment here is of different types. So ligaments hold the tooth in the bony socket, and this is basically forms an immovable joint. So this is the root of the tooth, and we have of course the enamel on the top, dentine in the middle, and then this whole tooth structure is held together in the bony socket through some ligaments, and it forms an immovable joint. Cartilaginous joints are categorized under slightly movable joints. So it lacks a synovial cavity. It can have very small movements. Bones connected by fibrocartilage or hyaline cartilage. So the examples are given here. If you just visit the slides, there are supporting figures. So example of immovable joints are here, particularly in the sternum, in the rib cage and the sternum. Also in the vertebral column, you have some examples of immovable joints. Okay. Slightly movable joints, cartilaginous joints, examples are given in the figure. You can see it is in the vertebral column of the spine. Okay. The pubic symphysis, where the two pelvic bone meet, is also a very strong joint, and it has very small movements, very small, slightly movable joint that actually is a connection or joint between the two pelvic bones from the two sides. Okay. Freely movable joints are actually known as, most popularly known as synovial joints. Okay. And these are the joints that we will discuss more. The hip joint, the knee joint, the shoulder joint, which is it contains a fluid within a joint cavity. And this you can see very clearly in the picture that there is a joint cavity and there is the articular cartilage, the two bony ends, and the synovial fluid is housed within this joint cavity. Okay, and of course you can see cross sections of the bone, and you have the ligaments holding the two bones in place and providing stability to form a joint. I think I stop here because it's already 10 o'clock. We can discuss more about synovial joints tomorrow. We have more time. Wait a minute. So I have to end the lecture here. Stop sharing. Can you see me? Sorry. Hello?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
I think I need to stop share. I have to stop recording. Yeah, stop recording.